Welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society. I am your host, Zachary Woodman. Joining me today is Will Gillis. Will is the director of the center and is a second-generation anarchist who's worked as an activist in countless projects since getting involved in the lead-up to N30, or the battle in Seattle. He studies physics and works regularly on the egalitarian potential of markets. His writing can be found on his website, humaniterations.net, as well as on c4ss.org. Today's discussion centers around a technical topic in political philosophy that has utmost importance for real-world political movements and many ideological debates: the distinction between positive and negative liberty. Will positions himself as defending a universalist conception of positive liberty as primary against particularly neo-Lockean libertarian views that place negative liberty as fundamental. But in many ways, he comes at it from a different, more highly consequentialist perspective than most theorists. He has some interesting ideas for how a heavy priority on negative liberty has led many American libertarians towards alt-right and fascist perspectives. This was a fun, philosophically exciting conversation, and I hope it is as thought-provoking for you as it was for me. Be warned, though, it is a long one, which is necessary since we covered a lot of ground, and Will takes a lot of great philosophical sophistication and thoughtful care into his views, which I hope comes across here. At any rate, here is Will Gillis. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I'm your host, Zachary Woodman, and joining me today is Will Gillis. Will, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
All right, so we've been wanting to have you on for a while. You kind of don't need any introduction to this audience, I don't think. But when I asked you what you wanted to talk about, you said you wanted to talk about something a bit more theoretical that I think has a lot more cash value than is usually played out in like popular discourse around anarchism. And that is the extent to which we should care about positive and negative liberty. So let's start out with a TLDR about what those concepts are and maybe how they apply to various political movements.
Well, everybody defines them a little bit differently, but positive and negative freedom traditionally get framed in terms of the freedom to or freedom from. And when you are working within a rights discourse, which I think most libertarians immediately jump to when they're hearing about these things, and also speaks to certain concerns that are very common in libertarian discourse around it, the frame is oftentimes from the point of view of a government and a government enforcing those rights. So positive freedom is oftentimes framed as the freedom to have healthcare, the freedom to have food, that kind of thing. And negative freedom is oftentimes framed as freedom from interference, the government interjecting itself. So a traditional fight over this and that framing is, do you have freedom? Like, my freedom to have healthcare conflicts with your freedom to not be inscripted as a doctor and forced to give me healthcare. And so that's, I think, the traditional frame that a lot of that discourse plays out, or a lot of how those terms play out inside of libertarian discourse. I don't come at it from that angle, and I think there's a lot of other different ways that people come at it. I'm not a rights theorist. I don't think that rights are a particularly good way of framing core ethical commitments. And I think that, however, I do think actually that the distinction between negative and positive freedom, or more saliently in my own use, freedom to and freedom from, actually have a certain conceptual gravity to them, and that gravity is reflective of some deeper dynamics, and as a consequence play out in terms of like overall like political movements. What sort of tendencies do people have? I think people tend to cluster, and although most, the average person, the average lay person, if you will, is oftentimes very, incoherent in their philosophical commitments and in the structuring of their political arguments. I still think that there are oftentimes there's oftentimes a lot more coherence than we give them credit for. And I think that coherence, or the tendency to like cohere around one or the other of these concepts, at least as I would phrase them, is very can be very insightful in understanding certain political tensions, certain political camps, and also in particular the split that happened within libertarianism when the Trump phenomenon took off. And many libertarians, many people that we knew, or many people that people in our circles argued against, Christopher Cantwell, Stefan Molyneux, the people who ended up forming the rightstuff.biz and launched the Daily Shoah and the more full-blown explicit neo-Nazi sort of material. All of those people came from a libertarian background, and there's many more that we could list and name, or people that have expressed deep sympathies for them. And I actually think that the distinction there uh, has been framed in many different ways. One way that distinction between like the good libertarians and the libertarians who went fash, one way that oftentimes gets framed these days is between those who are committed to the liberty of their own, of themselves, and those among them, versus those who are committed to liberty for all. And so there a lot of writers or theorists frustrated to see so many other libertarians fall to fascistic ideologies or nationalistic ideologies, have framed things in terms of, well, those people were never really committed to freedom for Saudi Arabians or freedom for people that they don't know. They were only ever committed to their own sort of like freedom. And I actually think that division plays out is deeply connected to the division between positive freedom and negative freedom. But the notion of freedom needs to be pulled back from the rights framework and framed more generally in terms of just like, what does it even mean to talk of freedom? And I think that on the one hand, you oftentimes have freedom in a very like specific to an identity or a subject, and that's a context in which freedom from makes a lot of sense. So if you have like a territory and a property, if you have a collective, if you have an identity as a person or a culture or whatever, and that is in some sense fixed or definable in some clear-cut way, then it is easy, it would in theory be easy to demark when that state of being is infracted upon, when someone violates that. And on the other hand, freedom too is a lot more expansive, and I don't believe has to require an individual subject. I don't think that it has to require lines of identity and constructions of selfhood, whether that be selfhood as like a collective self of the nation or what have you, and as a consequence is a lot more objective and a lot more fertile ground for anarchists and libertarians, and those who are advocates of freedom more generally, as a framework or a way to look at things. Anarchism has oftentimes been framed as a recognition that your freedom is my freedom, but I think there is a lot of theoretical confusion that plays out beyond that insight when it comes time to like turn that into an exact framework. So I think a lot of anarchists understand that there's solidarity and liberty, that an aggression against you is an aggression against me in some real deep sense, that no one is free until everyone is free. But that is clearly not the discourse or the frame of mind or the instinct of many of a more reactionary tendency, and that those of a more reactionary background come at it entirely from a negative freedom perspective. The question, the critical dimension that happens there is that, or the critical dynamic that happens as a consequence of that is that in embracing negative freedom, they end up worshiping a very static identity, very external idols or systems, structures that they want to preserve, and there becomes a kind of ossification of self, of one's social relationship, of one's nature, etc. So they talk of essential nature, that kind of thing, as a consequence.
All right. Before we get into how this maps onto political movements, I want to dive a bit more into theoretically what you think is going on when we're talking about freedom, specifically once it's divorced from rights language. Because, if you take any like intro to political philosophy course and they introduce these concepts, they do entail them as positive and negative freedom is about what kind of rights you have, and specifically definable in terms of what kind of obligations is entailed by those rights. So let me spell that out a bit more. A right to, life entails an obligation not to murder someone. A right to healthcare entails an obligation to give medical care to someone, what have you. So once we get rid of the rights language around this, what's left of our discussion about positive and negative freedom?
Right. Well, you can still speak of freedom from a state of, so I have a background in physics, and I've oftentimes been accused of certain reductionism. But I think that our maps of certain philosophical concepts, our conceptions of certain things have to map directly onto the concrete reality of the actual world. When you talk about a violation in terms of a property violation. That is a violation in terms of a material reality, right? Somebody crossed a certain line, and that line in the sand was drawn. And so we can talk about that in a very clear sense and a negative liberty sense. And I want to be clear that when I talk about the focus of libertarians, the focus of anarchists should be on positive liberty or on freedom too. That does not mean that I deny any legitimacy to individual or contextual situations where freedom from trespass is like a valid ethical dimension or consideration. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. But I think there's a lot will turn on which of those is our priority. And when we talk about freedom too, I think the only way the only way to talk about freedom in a physical system or in a social environment, social system, is in terms of the choices or the options or the possible states that system can be in. So I've said many times that I think that philosophy will not matter very much if it is constrained entirely to the context of humans as we know them today. History is a constantly moving kind of thing, and many of the minds that we are likely to engage with, or that there's the possibility that we will engage with in the future, may not be human. And I don't just mean that in the sense of like talking to dolphins or aliens or what have you, but it is likely that humans themselves will diverge inside of the ways that we construct ourselves, the ways that we build ourselves. It is also possibly the case that we will, spawn new life forms, AIs or what have you, and all these sort of science fiction concepts. In order to have philosophy speak to things in very general senses and very fundamental senses across, all of time, or in a universal sense, we must operate outside of the limiting or specific context of human and try to evaluate what freedom would mean outside of just that context. So one example, and this one even has direct correlates today, is let's say that there were two people who they were lovers, for example, and they chose to internetwork their minds together. So even in the early aughts, there were computer programmers and neurologists who undertook various self-modification under projects where they networked their brains together. So they implanted a chip instead of one lover's head and then in the other lover's head, and then, had some sort of broadcast between the two of them. And, if they stubbed their toe inside of one room, the other one could feel it in some new sense that was not previously an experience of theirs. And there's a pair of twins, quite famously for philosophical questions, that was conjoined at the brain, and they would use pronouns and refer to themselves in very complex or weird ways. I don't know that we should say that is that if somebody chooses to have that kind of thing where their notion of like selfhood is a lot more open-ended or less discrete, less clear-cut, I'm not sure that we should just write that off as an abomination and run to the hills. I think people should be free to make those kinds of internetworking or things as they become available. And that's a question of freedom too. I think they should be free to experience new modes of existence or new modes of relation towards one another. I'm not, and that's not a prescriptive thing, but if they want to, they should be able to. And if they do, how does our language map onto them? So what does it mean to talk of the negative liberty of two individuals, or maybe not two individuals, but or maybe not one individual? The notion of individuality implies very fixed and concrete notions of boundary, and it also involves a notion of like persistent self. More generally, of course, we can talk about these limitations upon the notion of selfhood and that kind of thing. But what that's not so relevant to the present context. But what will be relevant to all contexts on that is if our notion of liberty or our notion of freedom breaks down. If those if certain contextual assumptions change like that. And I would like to have a notion of freedom that survives and that flourishes even when humans or post-humans or what have you choose to relate to one another or with themselves or in all sorts of different ways that extend far beyond the conventional, normal, everyday human context that we engage with today. So that's sort of like the impetus for my consideration of like other ways to define freedom, other ways to engage with it. And in particular, I think that the best way to look at freedom is in terms of choice. So, freedom too is in many ways like how many choices do you have available to you? What is the width and the depth of that array of choices that you have? Because in a given situation, the amount of things that you can do to change the world or to affect the broader world is going to be constrained in a variety of different ways. Those constraints will oftentimes be physical or material constraints. but I believe that physical and material constraints have ethical substance to them. So I think, for example, an anarcho-primitivist might think that if you remove purely the social constraints, the social tyranny that that imposes upon you, or that stops you from being able to do certain things, or that like confines you to a cage or what have you, then you're free. But I think that we still have ethical commitments to providing people, or to making, achieving for ourselves, and arranging ourselves in such a way as to provide more options for others, to give them, tangible, substantive choice in the world around them, and then the physical sense of that. So, if you have two worlds in which there is no social oppression, but one of those worlds is socially organized in such a way, voluntarily, of course, in such a way as to provide more physical and material options for the individuals inside of that society, and the other one provides very little in the way of options, I think that we have an ethical commitment or attraction towards the one that provides greater material freedom. And so in many ways, I want to queer or complicate, problematize the notion, or the distinction between freedom as a social thing and freedom as a physical thing. I think that the lines between, certainly those are useful categories in many contexts, but I think that ultimately freedom has to speak more generally.
All right, so there were two complicated lines of thought going on in there, and I kind of want to tease them out a bit. So, have you ever read Gerald McCollum's 1967 paper that tried to spell out freedom as a tridactic relation?
I have not.
Okay, so in that paper, he basically argued that people who are fighting about positive and negative freedom are still talking about the same concept, and the concept of freedom has to involve three things: an agent, conditions that are preventing the agent from doing or becoming something, and something that agent wants to become. Now, historically, a lot of the discussions around this have been on what counts as a morally problematic barrier to what they want to become, the constraints. But it seems like part of what you want to do is question what we mean by an agent to be free or unfree as well.
Well, and also the extent, I mean, like, freedom, I think, when you go beyond the material sense, when you go beyond the social sense and consider material considerations as well, that opens up a huge array of consequences, right, and entailments from that. A world in which everyone is not constrained socially because property rights are so strong, you can conceive of a property rights domain where you are born and given a 15 by 15 foot patch of land, and everybody has that, and that tiles the entire world, and no one is ever allowed to leave their patch of land or trade or do anything beyond that. That is a notion of negative freedom in which you are not constrained in the sense that you are impeded, or that nobody changes you without your consent. But in that framework, you are very limited in what you can do to affect the world. You basically die within this tiny little prison bubble, having no impact beyond it. And I think that it's still substantive. I think that there are many people for whom that notion of freedom, even though it may conflict with Cullen's sense of the something impeding, that kind of thing, or a change inside of some direction. I think it's important to note that there are people who don't want to change at all, and who see the impediment or see the violation of their freedom as being something changing them from without. So it's not even that you have an impediment on your way to a goal. It may be simply the fact that change at all is negative and seen as violent or coercive or imperialistic or conquestive, etc. And I think that there are a great many people who gravitate towards that kind of resistance to change at all, and do so within the framework or the terminology, the sort of intuitive commitments of negative liberty and of negative freedom. And I think that that's a very real dynamic that plays out regardless of whether or not those people have entirely, in every way, broken out the philosophical entailments or the framework in a formal sense that they're using. So we can talk about the various ways in which different frames of freedom, positive freedom, negative freedom, have entail the other. So if you want a society of, broad flourishing, it is a classic libertarian argument that you need strong property rights. You need in order to have freedom to, you need freedom from. It's people will make arguments the other way around and say, socialists, for example, will say that in order to be like truly at peace, in order to be truly, not infringed upon, there have to be socially redistributed projects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a sense of causal dependency or even constitutive means that one is of the other. But I think that one's focus within those concepts is really important. What one builds up as one's chief lens on it is inherently going to take either a very arbitrary, so there's three options. One is a very arbitrary and garbled frame where, freedom is so deeply contingent that it becomes less of a universal or like a free of history kind of like ideal. Or you can have it as arbitrary in a different sense, but in a very like at least concretely definable sense, where it's this arbitrary line in the sand. Everybody gets their 15 square feet or whatever, or your nation is not allowed to contaminate my nation by spreading culture and memes and taco trucks or what have you. And then you have the third option, which is freedom is just like how many choices are there available to people within that society, or as a whole, what are the configuration states that are reachable by that system. So we can talk of freedom in a general sense, devoid of even agents, of course, to talk about like how much freedom is there in a hot gas versus like a crystal. And that's a use of freedom that philosophers of science and physicists and other folks will sometimes lean into. But I actually think that that's a useful lens looking at social issues. And so it's not merely that I want to complicate the notion of an agent. I'm not, I love agents and agency, and I'm not trying to, diminish, I think, the value that we put on the notion of agency or the notion of individual agents in our present world by playing with philosophical concepts and trying to make sure that they extend beyond even that use case or that context. And the reason why I'm trying to do that is because, one of the immediate cash out consequences of that is that it provides us with a much more clear language to talk of physical commitments or commitments with regards to material conditions.
All right. So let's start by comparing what you think the libertarian position on this should be with sort of the classical standard libertarian commitment is. And I'll give a voice to that for the sake of argument for the moment. So the neo-Lockean, more Nozeckian, Rothbardian position is that what counts as an agent is only the individual. We can't talk about like nations, non-voluntary collectives having liberties in any sense. They're only individual rights in this model. They say that these rights are only negative in the sense of they entail no positive obligations on other people. The right to life, liberty, property, etc. And they say the constraints that count, or the constraints that matter in this framework, are constraints are constraints that are intentionally impeded by other people. Like Hayek's famous line that freedom is, as he wants to use it, is simply freedom from coercion. So, on your view, what is wrong with that picture beyond simply that it doesn't capture other agents? What's wrong with other parts of that picture?
Okay, so to start kind of at the beginning of all the things that you were saying, the question of like whether or not an agent, whether or not a nation or an organization or collective entity of any kind counts as an agent is an interesting question, and it's one that I'm strongly on the side of like no, like not in any substantive sense, at least not within our current existing world. I'm a very hardcore individualist, but I'm a very hardcore individualist for what I see are very practical constraints or contextual constraints. Let's say, for example, that we were talking about the two twins who were born with conjoined brain. They have separate brain, but also the same brain in some weird and hard to define way, where our language starts to break down. And they speak of themselves as a single collective agent, but they also speak of themselves as two separate agents. It just depends on the context and switches back and forth. So in that frame, Are they a collective agent? Can we speak of them collectively? And I think that we probably should be able to. So the question then becomes, what differentiates the conjoined brain situation from a nation state, or even a collective of people, or a group of friends getting pizza together?
A ridiculous happy covenant community or something
stupid. Sure. Something along those lines. And I think the real difference there is like, well, in order to understand the real difference there, you have to look at like what makes it reasonable to talk of your entire brain being a single agent. Because your brain is a multifaceted, very complicated, messy sort of landscape of a bunch of different processes happening simultaneously in conflict with one another, etc. Consciousness is proven to be something of an illusion in a functional, sort of like very mechanistic sort of sense. But we still, in a very, reasonable sense, speak of there being individual agents, and we, think that there are, for Hayekian reasons, etc., very strong arguments that the contents of the inside of your brain, or whatever you is in this context, has access to the internals of your brain in whatever messy, multitudinous society, if you will, exists within your head, far, far, far better than you do the contents of somebody else's head, who is across a boardroom table from you. And those constraints are constraints of flow of information. We communicate very slowly in terms of overall information that we are able to send. The speed at which one can talk is much, much, much slower than the speed at which one can think. And one doesn't even just think in a single linear way. The brain is filled with all sorts of parallel processes that converge and diverge and come to consensus in all kinds of complicated manner. So if it were the case that a boardroom or a collective of people hopefully voluntarily, internetwork themselves or had some sort of advanced technology, you can brain-to-brain speed up thing that was far beyond
style type things,
right? Far beyond the bandwidth capacity available in human language as we currently know it, such that like the entirety of the internal subjective experiences can be known to one another. I think at that point it would not make a lot of sense to speak of individual agents, and it would, or it might in some ways, but it would start to become much, much, much more reasonable to speak of a collective agent there, because they would actually, like in the same way that there are different hemispheres of your brain internetworked, in that case, but like different regions and sections and processes within your brain doing different things, different subconscious processes, etc., that are all sort of collaborating at a very, very, very quick speed and a very like high and rich level of internet networktivity. The people networked around the boardroom, or the collective, or the commune, or the lovers, or the what have you, would at that point, I think, start to qualify in a real substantive, philosophical, and meaningful sense, even in terms of like economics and other things, as a collective agent, in a way that a organization, corporation, cooperative, whatever, falls very, very short of in our present world. And there are, of course, in economic senses, some reasonable ability to speak of a firm as an agent in an economy or what have you, but there are deep constraints internally within that firm, because the individual actors that comprise, in some sense, that firm do not have the capacity to truly communicate their experiences, their particulars with one another. So there's all this kind of information processing and shuffling back and forth in order to deal with that. And of course, as the firm size increases, as Kevin Carson and as C4SS and everything we've written like strongly focuses on, there are deep impediments to the capacity for that firm to function, for capacity for the CEO to know the conditions on the shop floor, et cetera, and the tacit knowledge of the worker on the shop floor, and that those things can create drastically underestimated diseconomies of scale. But if it were the case that we were in some sort of like fascistic or like corporatistic sort of future where we're all corporate slaves with explosive shock collars, and like chips are forcibly inserted into our brains, and we are internetworked together instead of some sort of horrific Borgian hive, then I think we could actually say that maybe the corporation in that sense would get around some diseconomies of scale, because it would no longer, language would no longer become such a logjam. And you wouldn't have to do the thing where everyone sits around a boardroom where one person speaks at a time, et cetera. All this sort of like information flow constraints that make individual agency and revealed preference on the market oftentimes far more effective modes of organizing. And I am in no remote sense advocating either forced anything, much less that kind of dystopian future. But I think that our philosophical language and our concepts should still be able to speak of those things. And we should cut reality at the joins such that we have the greatest latitude in our descriptive capacity. And so I think that it's important to recognize that collective agents like that could conceivably exist. So to go back a bit, you posited a number of things about the traditional libertarian sort of like frame on, and I think the traditional affinity that many libertarians feel about negative liberty, and certainly the rank and file will oftentimes speak about negative liberty as being the only true liberty, and positive liberty is that evil communist, like, authoritarian garbage that's going to chain us all up and force us to,
or just like a confusion with power is, I think, the way.
Right. So, and I definitely think that there is I think the libertarian instinct that there is that the history of the world is not a history of class conflict so much as it's a history of a conflict between power and liberty is a very admirable and correct take. It is probably the best take on the history of human history that there is. Also, that's not to say that like the class dimension or various forms of class analysis are not like in their own sense useful, but I think in terms of the striking at the root, power is fundamentally an evil, but I think that power is oftentimes misframed in that discourse. So we talk about power in ways that are deeply incoherent. We talk about, and you'll find this on the left, most definitely. So the left will talk of fight the power, but it'll also talk about like people power and power to the people. And, I'm not a big fan of democracy, so I don't particularly like the idea of collective domination, a bunch of people at a boardroom voting on what I get to do with my computer or my house or what have you. But, I do think that there is value in speaking of power versus liberty, but I would actually frame power as something that is rooted in actually something closer to negative liberty. I think that power fundamentally arises from the power dynamic, the psychology of power, the psychosis of power, the psychological or sociological phenomenon of power arises from a tendency.
I think when Hayek says power in that passage in Constitution of Liberty, he's not really talking about like that type of thing. He's just talking about like the ability to do something or the effect.
Sure. But more generally, I've heard many times like that people talk of positive liberty as power, because when you're talking of like capacity to do something, that oftentimes is strongly associated with power. Or I have the power to. And so, there is this conflation that oftentimes happens with, I have the freedom to and I have the power to. And I want to, emphasize that the traditional libertarian sort of like narrative around power on this is, I think, very good and very accurate. But I think that the definition of power has always been just like the definition of freedom, a little bit in flux and a little bit in self-contradiction in some ways. And so I think that the best way to think of power is in terms of the limitation of possibility. So when you have power over someone, it's less that I think it is a better usage of terms to say less that you have capacity in comparison to them, like you have more capacity to do something than they do, than it is to say that you have constrained their capacity, right? So if somebody is, wildly making noise inside of, driving around in circles in the street out front of your house at 3 a.m. in the morning, and you come out there with a shotgun and like tell them to get the fuck off or to stop doing that or else you'll shoot them, in some sense you have like power over them because you are constraining possibilities that they have available to them. You are sharply reducing the things that they can do. And I think that this is a better lens to understand power. Power should be understood in terms of the constraint of choice. So why do people pursue power? Is it a sense that like the pharaoh, if he has a number of slaves, he gets more freedom too, he can do more things? I think it's less that and more that he gets the appeal is less the capacity to impact the world in positive sense, although of course there is the confused and tortured and like tension of like, I accomplish this through utilizing you as a tool or as a means. But I think most often those in power and the function of power, the psychology of power, if you will, proceeds from an orientation of suppressing complexity in the world, suppressing the unpredictability of the world around us and the unpredictability of others. I mean, people oftentimes talk about like the market, and in that discourse, you will find a lot of language and a lot of uses of terms that that I think reveal deeply a hostility to the market because they see it as unruly, because they see it as unpredictable, and that there's so much choice that is like an affront to them and an attack
So
upon
why do we
them.
have so many toothpastes objection to the market?
Right. And, certainly human brains are limited things, and we can't process choices beyond a certain extent. We have to have made a structure to like how those choices get configured, and we have to process through them. But so if you present someone just right off the bat with 1,000 choices of toothpaste, they're maybe not going to be able to sort or get through them without like, an app or something that would be able to like assist them in their agential choice. And so there is something to be said for being overwhelmed. But I think that power is stupidity. To turn back to a certain phrasing or lens that David has come up repeatedly in the writings of David Graeber, violence is a very simplifying force for the most part, especially state violence. Violence strips away possibilities. When you do violence to someone, you oftentimes remove, and violence is of course a contested term that's used in all sorts of different ways, but in this use, violence strips away the options, the possibilities that are available there. And so speaking less in terms of the options of any particular agent, we can speak of the collective possibilities that are available. And I think that a lot of people are really terrified of possibility because that involves a lot of cognitive labor on their part in order to handle. So I think that when we look at like reactionary blowback against the global market, cosmopolitanism, etc., what they are doing is feeling like they are being besieged by choices. And also there's a notion that like they will have to change in order to keep up with those choices, in order to understand the lay of the land, this new complicated landscape in front of them. They will have to change themselves, which is a violation of their liberty to stay exactly the same. If they have to, for example, update their etiquette to like understand like people who use different pronouns. But of course, like a world in which like, that pronoun use or like trans people are respected, whatever, provides a great deal more objective freedom for everyone, because it provides you with greater freedom instead of every single person in the society would have freedom in terms of their gender identity, in terms of their presentation, in terms of the social relationships on that front, etc. But for the people who would have to do some updating of their etiquette, this seems like a violation of their liberty to stay exactly the same. And so it seems the positive liberty, the number of choices that people have, the number of options or configuration states that a society or a system or what have you has, in this way is in conflict with liberty in the reactionary limited sense of individual freedom from imposition, freedom from cultural influence. And this also comes up in Foucault and in other ways that people use power, and I don't really know that we need to go in all those directions. But the notion of freedom from, or the collapsing of that, can oftentimes make people very nihilistic about how they see power. Because if you operate from a world of freedom from, the tendency is to see that there is always going to be causal influence, right? Like we live in a world of causal influence. So it's not so much like how many configuration states can the society dynamically map itself to, how like internetworked are we, so that I can if I create a great meme, it spreads around the world. If I create, like, every single person can be, like in the positive sum world of a truly free market, every single person can contribute something of value that revolutionizes the entire world and changes everything. But from a negative freedom perspective, if I invent a better cell phone or something along those lines, and people start utilizing this new tool that everybody thinks is really great because it expands their freedom, the standard primitivist, for example, argument against that is they say, well, that constrains, or that forces those who do not want to change because like everybody else is doing it. So you're forced just by the gravity of the mass of the market or whatever to adapt the new thing. So, and you can map this from cell phone use of I don't want to have a cell phone. Everybody else has a cell phone, and this causes me to have a cell phone, or else not be a functional member of society in any remote way. You can map that also to everybody uses they pronoun, or everybody uses happily uses they pronouns or relation to people now. And if you want to be considered a polite, acceptable member of society, you have to likewise use they pronouns with people who identify such. And in both cases, the people who don't want to use the new fancy cell phone or the new fancy technology, and those who don't want to learn the new fancy social technology or cultural technology, which is to say gender neutral pronouns, because of course culture and language and that are just technologies like any other, those are basically the same function, right? Like in both cases, it's a reactionary impulse against change. And the thing in tension with it is a change that provides more possibilities for everyone. So you'll find primitivists who are deeply, deeply, deeply hostile to the voluntary choices of individuals to adopt new technologies because they feel that this creates a broad social pressure upon them or market pressure upon them to likewise engage or to change or to learn new technologies and change things. So if you look at like boomers frustrated about like the new tools and the new whatever, there is this deep twinning between like a frustration with new technologies and new tools and a frustration with new culture and with new social etiquettes or social technologies, linguistic technologies. We don't use that term anymore, grandma, that kind of thing. And so, that's basically the most, I think, visceral or immediate examples
All right.
of that kind of tension.
So I think what you're trying to say is that there's a tendency to link up a desire for strong protections of negative freedom with just a desire for stasis, a desire to restrict possibilities for the future, and so on.
Yeah. So the reason that I would put that is related to the reason why I think that negative freedom is ultimately an incoherent concept, and why I think that positive freedom is the coherent concept. So it's less the case that negative freedom is an incoherent concept in the same way that like a negative freedom and positive freedom are the same things would be incoherent. It's more that it would be an arbitrary distinction. In negative freedom, it requires a subject, right? It requires an additional amount of inputs. So you could have negative freedom where the conditions are the negative freedom of like America to be free from tacos coming in, or like whatever. You have to have like an agent or a descriptive subject or something that you like cleanly define, and that you like cleanly define against something else. So certainly it's far better when we're talking of like individual freedom, you know, the freedom of immigrant families walking across an arbitrary line in the stand to be free from seizure and abduction by ICE agents or what have you. Certainly that is like a productive and useful way in some sense, you know, and more so than to talk of like the nation being free from the sudden rise of taco trucks on every corner or what have you.
Right.
You know, obviously nations have no rights, but still though, there is this notion that you are stuck in this world where you have to say that something is free from something else. And in positive freedom, you can simply talk about the overall the number of configuration states of a system, and you don't have to divide up that system into one agent and like their property or their like, you know, broader sphere of concerns versus another agent and their broader sphere of concerns.
I mean, it's traditionally construed. It seems to me like you do need that in positive freedom. So like, let's take the example of, you know, anarcho-primitivists.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually not just merely defending like negative freedom in the sense that they want freedom from civilization or whatever. They're also trying to defend like a freedom to live in their, you know, primordial state or whatever. And the way they're characterizing the constraints is not the same way like a libertarian would characterize the valid constraints on negative freedom.
Well, certainly a libertarian and a primitivist are not necessarily the same thing in their framework.
That's not the point I'm making, but like they're saying that any accidental social change that comes along that inhibits their ability to be what they want to be, which is, you know, hunter-gatherers, whatever, is a morally problematic thing that needs to be stopped. In the same way but that requires them to identify themselves as an agent, and that requires them to identify a constraint in all these ways that you think are ultimately incoherent. But that bears stunning similarity to like the way a normal socialist would talk about, well, if market forces rise it up and make it hard for me to afford health insurance, then those market forces need to be stopped or something like that.
Sure, I'll surprise you on this one.
Like the way we talk about freedom in this, I guess that gets back to my first question, which is how are we supposed to decouple freedom from our conversations about rights? Because both are trying to presuppose, you know, in one case a right to static culture, in the other case a right to some good or commodity. How do we decouple our talk of freedom entirely from rights and just talk about it in terms of agent?
I'll surprise you a bit. I think that the socialist is actually more of a proponent of negative freedom. And
all right, that's not
most socialists, at least. Certainly, there are more like Promethean kind of socialists who have different aspirations, but they also tend to be like more resonant with at least more cosmopolitan libertarians. So I would say that actually both the primitivist and many socialists, many leftists make appeals to an essential state of being. and that there is like some sort of essential characteristic or static state of being that is being impeded, or we are being perturbed from. Capitalism is perturbing us from this glorious primordial state of being. And socialists make that appeal all the time, right? I mean, like, you don't have to look very far in certainly modern discourse, but it's all over. But when you're talking about something like the right to healthcare secured by a state, that inherently involves a lot of arbitrary lines that are being essentially put in as in terms of what counts as the ideal natural state, right? So are you obligated to are people obligated to provide you, is the state there to provide you with healthcare so that you live to be 300 at the labor and the cost of thousands of people slaving around across the clock to keep your postulous slowly decaying body held away, held alive by a constant infusion of chemicals produced at great cost, whatever. There are going to be trade-offs and there are going to be considerations, and I think a lot of socialists actually turn to deathists on this front, where if you probe them on this kind of thing and you're like, okay, well, how far does this go? What equals the level of the health that every single person should be guaranteed? And oftentimes they will straight up just at some point be like, oh, well, no one should live past that point, or that kind of thing, because that's just not natural. Not all socialists. Some, the better ones, I would argue, at least the better ones in terms of deep instincts, not necessarily their prescriptions, but many of those folks, I think you see across socialists as a whole, a deep appeal to a certain state of being. And this is core to Marx and to frameworks of alienation, and talking about that capitalism is this artificiality that is imposed upon us. All of those are freedom from sort of frameworks. And I'm sorry, I don't really see the argument that you're trying to make with regards to primitivists. If primitives are marching around inside their natural state of being, their essential identity, their essential nature, if you go in the Jordan Peterson kind of direction, which is just the inherent nature of, or the characteristic of all reactionary thinking, they're in their essential state of being, and then someone develops, I don't fucking know, some new technology that suddenly all the kid premies want to start using. The old premies will see that as a violation of their essential state of being. Right? This is an unnatural thing that you are introducing into our framework. And yeah, people are, the kids are starting to use this tool because they are weak, and you are exploiting their weakness to twist them against their fundamental state of being and their natural identity and natural state. That's the way that it would be framed, right? And so.
Well, the reason I try to frame that as a positive liberty argument is that traditionally, in the rights discourse, and this is, I guess, I'm still stuck in that mindset. The way we frame this is as, a right to a static culture entails an obligation on others not to use new technology,
sure.
Something like that.
Sure.
Whereas,
but again, I'm just not working in the rights framework at all. I want to be able to, because the rights involve specific individuals, bodies and rights are a really good system for legal stuff, but I don't think that they're necessarily a good system for how you make choices as an individual. Because let's say that you're on a deserted island and you have a commitment towards liberty. If you have that commitment towards liberty for yourself, or let's say you have a commitment towards the liberty of somebody who's with you because you love them and you care about them, right? And this is beyond your rights commitments to them, but you have this ethical commitment to their flourishing. You may thus have an ethical commitment to change the physicality of that island instead of such and such ways in order to provide them with more, tools or more capacity, more positive freedom. And that is an evaluation that you make as an individual, not as before a legal body of a polycentric legal council that is determining whether or not you've inflicted upon someone's right, or you've violated the or something along those lines. This is a much more primordial kind of ethical commitment. It's in terms of when you as an individual are looking at a state of matter on the board, and you have the option to move it about, which way should you move it about? And I think it's meaningful to speak of in that context, even if there's no other agents possibly present. And it's meaningful to speak of that prior to your submission or engagement within a legal system. A legal system is all about something that can actually stones socially. It's impossible, at least before anything like a current nation state or a government or anything like, like we currently have, to make any sort of evaluation as to like which state of affairs is actually going to, objectively increase the freedom of all. So now everyone needs to do precisely this and arrange their lives precisely this. And your house needs to be remade because the local inspectors have come by and said that your freedom would be maximized. Actually, if your house was demolished and remade to, well, like obviously that is completely beyond the calculational capacity of anyone, in anything like our society, anything remotely close to the world that we live in. But that doesn't mean that outside that evaluation that no government can actually successfully make in our society is not one that an individual shouldn't or cannot in their individual context make.
Well, right, but I don't think anyone talks about rights as an individual decision matrix. They talk about it as like a social coordinating mechanism.
Yeah, and I'm not talking about the social coordinating system. I'm talking about individual choices. And I think that is a far more, because I'm not talking about rights, right? So I'm talking about like the more primordial sort of ethical like orientation towards the world and ethical commitments or obligations or strategies or commitments. Sorry, I've said commitments twice. But, and so in that framework, that's where we start. And then after that, after we have like those sorts of like primordial sort of commitments, we might be like, oh yeah, it would be really good to have a rights framework as like a legal system, as a polycentric legal system to net maximize overall like agency of people and provide greater positive freedom in the world, because it is a good means to provide that. And that's something that like, diminishes the amount of conflict between individuals in our society, etc. But that is something that follows secondarily from the more primordial, commitment to a certain state of affairs, which is to say like more choice, more configuration states.
So that seems right to me. And it's very reminiscent of what Brennan and I think David Schmitz argue is their conception of why positive rights matter to libertarians. But like note that in that framework, you'd still have to demand that the rights, the negative rights in this case, are in some sense held, if not like logically prior, but lexically prior to the positive rights, right? Because like it would be like saying, look, we need to protect your property rights, even if it means that in certain cases someone won't get housing or whatever positive good we're talking about, or even if it's in some cases it means we lose out on the preservation of culture for someone who wants to do it, because it enables greater flourishing for everyone in society from there on. So like the negative rights would be held as like the true proper rights, but the positive rights would just be held as the means that those negative rights are attaining, right?
If we were to make this decision on behalf of the whole of society, but we are never in that position where we are making the framework for the whole of society, right? So like libertarians are hung up so deeply on like essentially the framework of writing position papers for the government. And I agree that, certain things fall out of that as a consequence, but bear with me. So if you are an individual in a given society and you're with a number of other individuals, and we can go to some sort of a priori, like contrived, you're all on a desert island, you all emerge full form, whatever. Yeah. And you have to like arrange among yourselves, like how you're going to arrange yourselves or what's going to like come out of that. I think you will through practice, through direct hands-on trial and error with one another, come to certain détentés, right? I agree not to steal your toothbrush if you agree not to steal my toothbrush, whatever, or like, twig. As a consequence of that, broader commitments and like notions of a legal system like the NAP or something like that could emerge to some extent. But those would emerge not in this a priori sense. They would emerge through the particulars of the environment that you're engaging with. Like it would make sense instead of some contrived sci-fi scenarios for air to be like property. It would not make sense in a lot of others. It would make sense for that to be like collective property in a variety of different ways. Individual property versus collective property. And so those depend upon the individual conditions that those people are embedded within. Similarly, though, I could conceive of a situation, because I'm a consequentialist, where, you're abandoned on an island and there's time-sensitive things and you're all going to fucking die or whatever, where it would be just or ethical, setting aside notions of justice entirely, where it'd be ethical as an individual to make a choice that would maximize the agency of all by like making sure that everybody survives by, say, inside of some way violating someone's agency briefly or something along those lines. I'm a consequentialist, so I think that there are always going to be like edge case exceptions that individuals should be aware of, right? Like we can arbitrarily stock the decks and contrive a situation where like it is for the best of all humanity if you violate the NAP a little bit, right? Like a bomb's going to go off, and in order to like turn the bomb off and save however many tens of millions of lives, you have to like violate someone's property rights in such and such way, or you have to like do some sort of like harm to somebody, you have to poke them or something. There's all sorts of like contrived situations that we could occur. And as a consequentialist, I'm going to say like, yeah, you should act as an utilitarian inside that framework, violate the rural utilitarian generality of the polycentric emergent detente or legal system, agreed upon norms or civil conventions of etiquette or whatever inside that given society. But I agree that like in terms of what those etiquette or rules or norms or things would look like, is something somewhat close to individual property, at least with humans as they are presently constituted and function. I'm such a hardliner on this that I don't particularly like even collectives or cooperatives, fully voluntarily kind of things. I'm more like, well, every individual should go off on their own kind of like thing. I would never, obviously voluntary is voluntary on that, but my inclination is strongly against collective structures, against those kinds of things, or any sort of violation of individual freedom. However, as a consequentialist, I think that there are exceptions to that. There are inherently going to be exceptions to that. And part of enshrining individual agency is making sure that people are aware, don't lie to themselves about like their deepest, most prior ethical commitments, which are to positive liberty, so that in a given situation when something is like particularly, extreme, they might, jump out of their normal habit or their normal instinct, their normal starting assumptions, and recognize after sufficient due diligence or whatever in that given situation that there's an exception there. And this can be all kinds of different situations, but, I'm a consistent consequentialist on this front. So, obviously I'm not going to say that rights are like this a priori kind of thing in terms of like a deep first order commitment that someone has.
All right. So yeah, I think much of your disagreement with most orthodox libertarians comes down to the fact that like most neo-Lockeans are not consequentialist and you are.
Sure.
Hayek probably, Hayek, with someone like Hayek, something's going on where he's just not really interested in forming the fundamental primordial ethical commitment. He's just interested in coming up with, like what you said, the position papers of a government or whatever. So yeah, that it sounds like that's where that disagreement is. But I do want to get back to something you said earlier at the very beginning, where you said that you think much of the reason why many libertarians went full on fasci after 2015-ish was because of their commitment to negative liberty primarily.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that doesn't seem right to me, because like a lot of the things that you're describing that they did or a lot of the things, at least in the way I think about positive and negative liberty, is in terms of what obligations they entail and so on.
Sure.
They're asking for like a freedom for their collective nation state oftentimes to be able to preserve its culture or something like that. And that it just seems to me like what's going on there is not that their commitment to negative liberty is what caused them to turn fasci. It's just that their commitment to liberty was always a pretty shallow cover for
their commitment to individual liberty, certainly. If you continue to frame things in terms of individuals as the framework, then yeah, you're going to stick with conventional libertarianism. My point here is that if you're going to break from libertarianism in any direction, right? Like your commitment in terms of what you frame liberty as primarily is going to be incredibly relevant. So if you are thinking primarily in terms of freedom from, so you start out as a get off my property libertarian, not as a like through the market, all of us together can have more options libertarian, right? Like two very distinct camps of libertarianism and two distinct arguments that actually in some ways conflict with one another sometimes. So you start out with the like get off my property libertarian, and then somebody says like, well, you have this different sense of property, which is now like the national property, but there are people who are putting taco trucks on your extended property. You're going to be like, get off my national property. And so, yeah, of course, there's a breakdown of individual liberty in that frame. But my point on this is that like the overall commitment is still negative liberty.
But I don't think it's just a commitment to individual liberty that breaks down. It's also a commitment to the way they think about obligations. Because like, okay, so let's take the case of, a fascist like Hoppe.
Mm-hmm.
Like he still wants to say that what he's ultimately defending is individual liberty because he's defending, the individuals who form Maybe Hoppe's not as good example because he's kind of dropped that charade. Maybe Kinsella is a better example. They just want to say that they're defending, the right of individuals to form these private associations or whatever. But they still want to say that, like, someone coming near them who is, not a white dude is violating their right to want everyone around them to be a white dude. It's like, to me, like, they're saying that some positive obligation exists on the part of non-straight white dudes to not go near this person. And that seems to me like a positive obligation that they're putting on everyone else, which is incoherent and bad, but not exactly negative liberty as such, even though they're still at least theoretically maintaining their individualism.
I mean, I see the central issue with Hoppe, and I've had a lot of conversations with none of these folks. And so if you remember like Darren Note or other people who like, used to be part of these circles, like, I mean, his specific specific responses to conventional libertarians and his sneer was, you guys don't understand that there are valid agents larger than individuals.
Oh, okay. That's why I said Hoppe. Maybe Kinsella is a better example.
Sure. So I definitely think that like the majority of the people, and when you look at like, all of the people who went like full fash, because like Kinsella, I'm not going to put him on the same camp as, I think it would be unjust to put him in the same camp as Stephen Molyneux or what have you, or Cantwell. Those people clearly believe in a nation, and these people have different levels to, they're tortured steps from individual stuff into nation or whatever. But in a lot of ways, they're free, like they were never thinking in terms of the obligations upon others. Their entire frame of freedom was like, you can't tell me what to do, get off my property. And so and I think that it's very important to note that like negative freedom, because it like, it requires drawing lines in the sand. This equals an individual. This equals a nation, which is the relevant agent here. Like this equals how their property functions, which is the extent of their, et cetera. Like all of those things involve like relatively arbitrary like injections of certain things in, right? Like none of those things are inherent to the physics of the universe. None of those things are like, none of those things are fundamental first principles. We may emerge upon certain détentés through practice and through engaging with this works for everyone. But we don't, we have certain public property and private property even within like even usually the most hardcore Lockean still admits some level of public property with regards to things like air and whatever. There's always like some level of shift back and forth in terms of where they would draw those lines. And so there's always this deep like arbitrariness in terms of that. So somebody happily, if their notion of one of the core things I'd say about the psychology of negative freedom and the way that rhetoric works is that it makes people think of things. It encourages people to think of liberty purely in terms of like infringements upon them, however they choose to self-identify, right? And so as their notion of self extends to a nation, or whatever inside of that arbitrary construction there, or their notion of self is like, the air surrounding me will be free of any of gays kissing one another. Whatever the sort of fucking extent of their like sudden notion of selfhood or extended property or extended whatever ends up being, they're still going to have the same sort of framework, and they're still going to have the same sort of like orientation towards the world, which is one that does not care what obligations this places on other people, because they are entirely thinking in terms of like how they are impeded upon, the violations of these specific things.
I think what's going on with them is they're just trying to find whatever vocabulary they can to justify a set of pre-existing intuitions.
Well, these pre-existing intuitions are surrounding negative liberty, right? Like they are a certain frame of mind that
I think they're surrounding a deeper notion of agency, not a deeper notion of negative liberty proper.
Well, okay, so what would you say in terms of like the differences in terms of agency? Because these people, if you look at them back when they were hardline individualists, because remember, Cantwell...
agency is the wrong word, identity.
Cantwell was a hardline individualist, but I don't think that, and the thing that basically switched is he went from an individualist to a collectivist. He started to like see the nation as some sort of valid thing, as white people as some sort of valid overall agent that should have like rights, or freedoms contra love, to be free from race mixing or whatever bullshit he's on. That sort of thing, like he shifted entirely on that one commitment, but he didn't shift on the ways that he frames that, the negative liberty underlying framework of rhetoric, right? And I think that that's a sincere commitment on his part. And I think that if we have to psychologize even further, like a lot of people came to libertarianism, especially when it was a space that you would become like radicalized through the internet. It was a series of arguments that would make you feel elite and special online because you could easily counter some like left-wing arguments, right? And you could like, and with that sense of eliteness, it was the identity that mattered there, right? Like you wanted to feel a certain way, you wanted to be in relation to the world in a certain way, and then certain senses of status of which is and many people, they consider that like something that they own, right? If your sense of status on the internet gets infringed because a bunch of feminists run ramshot over you in the comment section and just totally fucking make fun of you for your bad fucking arguments, your sense of status has been hit, your property has been violated. Now, like, and I don't mean property in any reasonable libertarian sense, but in the sense in which they were ultimately like viscerally, psychologically connecting with that concept, right? And so the reaction that came as a consequence was, oh, okay, well, we'll do whatever it takes in order to re-secure the stable stasis that I think that is me, and that where I don't have to learn pronouns, where I don't have to like engage with in cultural ways that I don't know, or like learn new things or anything else. And that also like I get these variety of things, like I get free healthcare, but I also get like an enslaved woman who serves as my wife that the white, the supremacist council gives to me through the horrible society that we've set up. Like they see these things as restoring the natural way of the way that things should be, the way that they would be on their own, had they not been like disrupted by the chaos and the complexity and the degeneracy of modern civilization.
So that I agree with, but I guess what I'm getting at is my problem with, or the reason I think they became fasci is because that's the way they viewed libertarianism in the first place. And it wasn't that they like bought the negative liberty lines that caused them to go through there. Sure. Maybe the negative liberty lines was what attracted them to libertarianism in the first place.
Sure, I don't mean to argue that like anyone who is attracted to the NAP is a fascist. And
no. I know that's not what you're arguing.
Right.
I thought what you were arguing is there was some causal thing within the NAP that caused, or within.
Well, I think it is rhetorically like the sort of I mean there is a causal connection here in the sense that like the libertarian movement, which was attracted to the NAP, and like some people even define libertarianism explicitly solely in terms of the NAP, right? So, but obviously excludes a ton of libertarian history and blah blah. But like if people who had the negative liberty bent, they took that in terms of the rhetoric. What does that rhetoric turn to? What does that rhetoric like encourage? Who do those people attract? What sort of things become standardized inside of a community that reiterates that kind of negative lens again and again and again, and sees things primarily through that negative lens? Well, there's going to get a ton of people attracted to it who are like, well, yeah, get off my property. And are not going to have the like, I want rights for everyone, or if they're within a rights framework, they're going to be like, I don't care about that. I want them off my property, right? And so that orientation has infested the hell out of the libertarian movement. But it is not to say the sincere libertarians are not somewhat to blame on that front, because, and not all of them, but I think that there are certainly some thinkers and some folks who leaned into the kind of negative liberty like frame and the rhetoric and that kind of stuff that goes around that. And certainly there are people who like lean into that even more to this day. I mean, fucking, you can go all over the von Mises Institute and see fucking people leaning into that kind of shit, and quite intentionally, right? To make those kind of connections.
So I guess what I'm saying is like rhetorically putting a ton of emphasis on that stuff was a bad move all the time. But like as a matter of philosophical theory, it's not as if there was anything about that was inherently leading to fasci.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I would draw those lines so concretely, or that there's a big difference between those two different concepts.
I don't want to armchair.
Sure.
How much longer? So let's move on. One of the big classic objections, and I think that this would be an objection that would run orthogonal to you, but it's worth bringing up anyway, is that most like very philosophically inclined classical liberals would bring up, is that positive liberties entail contradictions.
Sure.
So if I say, I have a right to food, I have a positive right to food, and you have earned this food through labor or whatever our mechanism for you earning the food is, that entails that we both have a right to this food. There's a contradiction that'll lead to chaos in society, or maybe we just don't want logical contradictions in our system of rights anyways, and so that's why positive liberties aren't a thing. What's your take on why that's not a good argument against positive liberties?
Well, it's a good argument against like socialist positive liberty. It's a good argument if you're like a statist and you're arguing for positive liberty within a statist framework. Like, sure, absolutely. But I don't, obviously it's not a particularly good argument against the kind of like anarchist framework that I'm presenting.
I
So,
don't think it's an argument against the statist framework explicitly. It's just an
sure,
argument
sure, sure.
against.
Sure, sure. So again, this notion of positive liberty, they're specific liberty. So they're definitely introducing like arbitrary like you have a framework of one positive liberty or negative liberty, and you can. It's one way to look at it is that you can have like if you write a sentence, X should be free from Y, and then you can write another sentence that says like X should be free to Y, right? Like you can stick any number of arbitrary things in either of those sentences and frame them in all sorts of different ways. And you can even try to replicate precisely through extenuate convoluted subclauses and things exactly the same condition, exactly the same sentence that was before, just replicate at the bottom because of like linguistic chicanery essentially. And like I totally recognize that's not the point here. Is that the X and the Y in the sentence of freedom from is inherent. You cannot say freedom from without there being an X and a Y, but you can take the freedom to sentence and largely divorce it of any arbitrary particulars. So you could take the lens as wide as
free to fulfill themselves or something weird like that.
You could take it as wide as the entirety of the universe, right? Like you could take the entire causal block of anything that we can see, or like the edge of the wave function of the universe, and you could just say all of this should have maximal states of possible configuration state and intermingling. And there's more convoluted ways that you can talk about, like specifically the internetwork. Positive liberty through internetworking in causal dependency. But the point is that the things that you're sticking in there, things like food, that's far more arbitrary than I would ever give license to. I think that those things might fall out as strategies. So if, for example, I say like what creates more freedom as a whole, I'm talking of freedom as a very like concrete concept. And then somebody might argue that like, in order for everyone to be free, everyone should be fed, so we should set up some sort of like food program or something like that, and blah, blah, blah. And then we could talk about strategic commitments as a consequence in that thing, but that would still be something where like we could easily point out contradictions or tensions that would be quite devastating in terms of like those applied instantiations. So if, for example, you were to say like, in order for everyone to be free, we need there to be a Soviet state that blah, blah, blah. Well, then the anarchist critique still applies, but the anarchist critique of states is not like an a priori critique. It's a very like it's a less a priori sort of like statement. The anarchist critique of states is like you have the centralized power structure. There's no checks and balances upon it. Not fundamentally, the liberal system of like internal competing things is not actually like very. It's a triopoly or not. It's still a very monopolistic sort of overall framework. How are you able to stop that from metastasizing and going off in bad directions? It's very easy for a system of power, a system of centralized control or whatever, to be turned inside of these negative directions. It's very hard to lock it down and certify that forever it will never, turn against its citizens and it will only do exactly this. The Faustian bargain that you make today will never turn into something horrifically worse. Like, the anarchist critique of the state is incredibly powerful, and it demolishes all consequentialist arguments for the state, because people are always saying that the state is like the solution to some sort of collective action problem, and that consequentially for good ends we need to like have a state in order to solve these things. But the problem with that, the catastrophic problem with that, is that the state itself is a collective action problem, and it's a collective action problem in a variety of different ways, and to horrific ends, because if you allow any centralized or singleton of like a local singleton or even oligarchy or whatever, any sort of like concentration of power in those ways, it's going to run ramshot. It's all other checks and balances going to fall aside. And if it wants to suppress the liberty, if somebody inside that thing is like, I would actually not like to think about the complexities of like broader liberty, I would like to have like exactly this every day, they're able to accomplish that and it's very hard to derail or stop those states once they've come into existence, as we see by the entirety of the existing world. And so, like, the collective action problem of states, like, more than sufficiently demolishes almost every positive liberty argument for, statism or anything like that. That does not mean, however, that all arguments via positive liberty. So, for example, food is a great great situation. So we exist in a world of vast injustice, even according to like any sane libertarian legal system. The vast majority of wealth and distribution in this world was not justly acquired. It is the legacy of slavery, of colonialism, of imperialism, conquest, genocide, etc. Redlining, Jim Crow, every single step of the way, tariffs, what have you, all of these things have systematically contributed to bloat of business size, accumulation of power in the hands of a few, blah, blah, blah. All of these, the systematic spread of violence across our existing society is catastrophic. It would, of course, not, and that creates strong impediments to freedom. It creates strong impediments. There are people who are starving today, and starving, an ounce of bread in that, or a slice of bread in the hands of a starving urchin or whatever is of far more value to maximizing freedom in the world than it would be in the hands of somebody who has had more than enough and has the money to buy more. But it would not be, it would be catastrophically bad strategy to institute some kind of socialist state that would go through and implement the redistribution of that wealth. However, there are differences that fall out in terms of my commitments versus the commitments of more traditional right libertarians. So if you are in a situation where you see a starving urchin and a corporation or some shit like that leaving food and whatever thing, you may break the property rights of their dumpster to break into their dumpster to break out piece of a loaf of bread and give it to starving slum dwellers or something along those lines. You have certainly violated the freedom. I mean, I would hope that this is a clear-cut situation where violating the property right in some twisted sense of, obviously unjust title. Going back,
libertarian could just account for that by saying they don't actually have a property right.
Sure. But the point there is that many libertarians default nonetheless on the negative liberty, better be on the safe side of negative liberty, better be on the safe side of respecting the existing property right, even if it is an unjust property right. Because after all, we as white people in North America, in some very tangible, real way, could be said to be beneficiaries and that our property is unjust because of historical subsidy, whatever. But it is also incredibly convoluted, right? There's the actual, doing restorative justice in that situation is almost beyond calculation, and the damage that would be done to a great many people that live today would be incredibly huge if some of that was to be done in some sort of collective redistribution or remuneration. And that is not to say that some should not be done inside of some contexts and ways, but if we were to kick all colonial beneficiaries instead of whatever way out of North America in order to repair the damage done by the genocide of the Native Americans, I don't think that would be a net expansion of liberty. But libertarians tend to get so afraid of that kind of possibility, of the possibility of any sort of settling of these unjust titles in any way, that they bar any sort of violation of existing property title, right? If every property title is in some way problematic, their instinct is going to be, well, we should stick with what we've got because anything else is chaos and the decline of civilization, or the collapse of order, and underneath that, what's mine is mine, and there is a certain order to this world, and how dare you try to change the order of this world, and in particular the state of affairs, the state of which things are at. And that is a deeply reactionary tendency, right? So there are plenty of libertarians, I know them well, who oppose groups like Food Not Bombs, who in many cases acquire their food legally through contracts with, or agreements, informal agreements with food producers, whatever. But in some instances, in different cities, whatever else, may break into dumpster a bunch of perfectly good bread and serve it to the homeless. And in those instances, I think it's dead clear cut that the libertarians are wrong, or that those libertarians are wrong, and that it is absolutely just from a consequentialist perspective, is absolutely ethical from a consequentialist perspective, to at the very least take that bread. But the important thing there is who is taking that bread and how that is functioning. And the anarchist critique of mass redistribution systems through a centralized state don't apply in that instance, because you have essentially sort of top-down redistribution, bottom-up redistribution. If if you decide that, certain corporations claim the property is not valid, which I think, are very good arguments even within standard libertarian theory, would be the case for a great many like mainstream corporations. It would certainly fall out that it would be just to shoplift from that corporation. But I think the vast majority of libertarians would instinctively oppose that.
Or at least morally permissible, maybe not.
Yeah, sure. But I would, but of course, like my framework says, like not just morally permissible, but morally like obligatory, even not even just praiseworthy, but obligatory to certain beneficiaries, certain things. If you could like expropriate from them, as like if a community of dispossessed people inside of a certain society, and I'm going to be very abstract about this, but if you have a slums that have been held down and there's some corporate town and like very clear cut situation, you have this corporate town that has like controls the wealth, or they have the supermarket or whatever. I think it's not just morally permissive, but it would be and not just praiseworthy, but obligatory for individuals in that society or in that situation to riot and loot that fucking supermarket and take those goods back home to the community that's basically been looted by the plutocratic like conditions that led to that corporation having all that power over them. So most libertarians are not going to have that instinct, and the reason why they're not going to have that instinct is because they like are deeply reactionary in the ways that they approach the edge cases, right? And I think that there's like value to a certain amount of timidity or a certain amount of concern in situations where you're potentially doing harm to other people, right? Like I am not advocating, and I am called a class traitor on the regular I'm not advocating going into the houses of someone who's like vaguely richer than you, has a slightly higher middle class than, if you're lower middle class or whatever, and that just like taking all of their stuff, right? Like I'm not advocating anything remotely like that. I don't think that would be like just. I think that the harm would be off the charts, and that there are other ways to handle those kinds of disparities if they are unjust, or if they, that people don't have just property title, these things, than like violating someone's like own home if they have done nothing, right? Like they're not like a mayor of any town or anything like that. There's just somebody who benefited from a job in such and such way. Like I think that it's very praiseworthy to have limits, to be deeply critical about any action that could conceivably do harm to innocents, to other people, and to err on the side of caution. But the reactionary impulse is not just caution. I think it is also an impulse towards stasis and towards preserving a state of affairs.
Can I get something out of that real quick? So
Yeah.
How do you get the sense of obligation in those cases if we're not working in a deontological framework at all?
Sense of obligation in what way?
In the case you were talking about, where there was.
So there were two cases I was talking about. So there's the case I was talking about in terms of like the obligation to loot.
That's the one I'm asking about.
Okay, so in that case, it seems pretty straightforward. Like, if you care about people and you want to expand liberty in the world, then you have a moral obligation, I think, to like pass bread to a starving homeless person on the side of the street. I think that's a pretty clear moral obligation. I don't know that very many people would not recognize that obligation. Even I think most libertarians would recognize that there are, not NAP obligations, but they would frame them as like secondary obligations that we cannot speak to in a general political sense. And it's hard to like lock these things out. And certainly no society should be able to speak to these. But I think most libertarians would recognize that there is such a thing as moral.
I think a lot of libertarians would have problems with calling that an obligation in the same sense that we talk about an obligation not to murder or something like that.
So I think there are a lot of libertarians who are Christians. I think there are a lot of libertarians who are Jewish. There are a lot of libertarians who are religious. And within those religions, there are obligations, not just praiseworthy, but obligations to tithe your wealth and to give to the poor and whatever. And so just appealing to those like religious traditions, I think it's pretty easy to say that there are a lot of libertarians who would happily concede, or who would concede that there are certain obligations upon them. They would just not see those obligations as obligations that any society or social body should feel or should be able to speak to. And I happily admit that no state should be involved in a redistribution.
Well, that's exactly why like a lot of, and not just like, I'm not talking about like, normal run-of-the-mill libertarians. I'm talking about like, the Mackeys and the David Schmidts of the world.
Sure.
Who would be like, well, the problem with that obligation is that it is unclear who the identity of the holder of that obligation is.
Sure.
And very similar to the objection to positive liberties in the first place, where like it entails contradiction. The other side of that problem is that if we say you have a positive right to, healthcare, it becomes unclear who's supposed to provide the healthcare.
Sure. I don't think that we have I don't think we have a specific positive obligation in a very concrete, fundamental, absolute a priori sense to pass bread to a specific person in front of us. I think that is a likely strategic entailment that comes from a broader obligation to expand liberty for all. And so in much the same way that I think that we have an obligation as an individual to assist someone who is being oppressed, so for example, to smuggle guns to someone who is a slave held by a slave owner to help them revolt, or to shoot their slave owner for them and to liberate them. And I think that is an individual obligation, very different from like a state invading and shooting Saddam Hussein or something along those lines because of all the characteristics of states.
The question would still be,
but like, there are a lot of people being oppressed in the world right now, right? There are a lot of people who are under the boot. Do you have a specific obligation to every single one of them, or do you have an obligation in the abstract sense to do as best as you can to facilitate liberty in the world? And I think that you do, because I'm a consequentialist and I have these positive entailments or whatever. I think that we do have an obligation to struggle to make the world a better place and to provide liberty for all, right? Like, I think that is something that we as individuals should have. And this is a big distinction between a negative libertarian in the way that they view the world and a positive libertarian. There were actually libertarians who, and not very many, thankfully, but there were actually libertarians I saw who were objected to support for people protesting in Hong Kong against the PRC and the oppressive government regime that they have instituted in Hong Kong. And there were a couple different takes that I saw in the muck of the lowest of the libertarian movement. And not to define everything by the worst examples, but the very fact that these things would exist is, I think, indicative. And so they said, like, we should not, that's their concern. That's the concern of Hong Kong's. We should not cheerlead one way or the other. To do so is imperialism that infringes upon their culture, blah, blah, blah. And then there were other people who were upset about, like, the destruction of government property, which, in terms of instincts, that's just, but anyway.
It is wrong.
Yeah, it's terrible. But that would emerge in libertarian, self-identified libertarian circles, I think, speaks a lot to the certain ways that certain people, the rhetoric as it currently, and the certain formulations of arguments as they are currently made, have certain biases or have some certain inclinations or bring certain people in. And so, like, why would that even exist in the first? Why would those people even make those arguments? Sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit. So in that frame, I think there are a good many libertarians who do not believe that we should. So, for example, there are a lot of anarchists who went to go fight alongside the Kurds in northern Syria against ISIS to save a vast number of people from extermination, etc. And that was an individual choice for those individuals who went, and the coalitions, the entailments. We can talk about more complicated things with regards to, like, the function of the Kurdish, supposedly, like, more libertarian municipalist like framework, which is not fully anarchist. And you can talk about their entanglements with the U.S. empire and geopolitical things, whatever. But there are individuals who felt that it was obligatory upon them as anarchists to go off and to fight for somebody else's liberty. And there are anarchists who, in history, like Sanders Spooner, but many others, who fought or who felt obligations upon them to fight for slaves that were being oppressed in the antebellum South, and in various ways of struggle against that regime. But were willing to sacrifice quite a lot in order to do those things. And they did not see those framework. They did not see their commitments as praiseworthy, trivial, like, oh yeah, I guess you could. That's really great. You get a gold star. They saw those as, like, critical necessities and as things that, like, any person of good conscience would be absolutely obligated to struggle and to do. And I think we can talk about, like, similar things with regards to, like, ICE concentration camps today. Are there obligations beyond fighting for your own liberty? And I think, if, realistically speaking and charitably speaking, I think a lot of libertarian formal theorists would agree that, because the good ones argue for liberty for all, that there are sometimes obligations to, hide Jews in your house during the Holocaust or what have you, to do certain things beyond that, we care about people beyond our nose, beyond our property. But I think that a lot of libertarians don't. And I think that that such a situation has come into existence as an atrocity is a deep, deep, deep stain upon the history and the legacy of the libertarian movement. Not that it hasn't a lot of other dark fucking things in its closet, but that led up to that. But I think that, that is a reactionary inclination that stems from a certain framework around negative liberty. That is not to impugn the honor of every single person who works primarily from a negative liberty perspective. But I think that negative liberty versus positive liberty maps very cleanly and very directly on to, although not absolutely, but there's a lot of strength to that mapping onto whether or not you think that you have an obligation to fight for other people's freedom. And whether or not you think that you have an obligation to sacrifice some of your liberties or some of your freedom in your everyday life in order to provide more liberty to other people. So, a lot of libertarians are not showing up in the protests against the ICE camps. Just let's be real about that. We can condemn leftists for not showing up for the longest time, although many did during Obama, et cetera. I was part of these vast protests during Obama and during Bush against constraints on immigration. And the people who showed up are primarily leftists. And some libertarians deserve a great deal of praise for being consistent in their positions throughout that entire period. But the rubber didn't really meet the road, because being abstractly correct was all that they were really up to get. And, I don't mean to psychologize and suggest that this is entirely the same thing as that libertarianism is just being, this pursuit of being right technically, and nothing else. Although certainly that's what seemed to have motivated people like Cantwell or Stefan Molyneux, definitely. The sense of the feeling of eliteness and not the feeling of actually sacrifice. But I think that there is the rot of negative liberty as a culture, as a rhetoric. It has consequences, and one of those consequences is that people don't feel obligated to take actions on behalf of other people, and to fight for their rights and their liberties, and to if not rights, their broader freedom, their choice, their options. And so we can talk about all the libertarians who fell directly into fascism or fell into Hoppian sort of Pinochet helicopter, whatever bullshit, support the Proud Boys, all that dumb shit. But there's all the libertarians that just didn't show up to resist it. There's all the libertarians who just didn't feel that they had an obligation to jump into a pool to save a drowning kid, not to use the classic example, but it's there.
I think a lot of what's going on in that disagreement is just different senses of the use of the word obligation. But I don't want to stick on inside libertarian baseball for
sure
much longer. Well, let's push back from another direction. So I'll take the perspective of a standard someone who would argue from a more standard positive liberty angle.
Sure.
And they would probably hear a lot of what you're saying and say, but you're kind of missing the point of why we care about these positive liberties, a socialist or Marxist, which they care about improving the material conditions of the worst off right now. And in this very strong abstraction about, positive liberty for an entire system being abstractly expanded,
sure.
Whatever, we really care about, they'd say, is making sure that people have bread on the table tomorrow. And
right.
They would say we need, in some sense, the strong moral language revolving around freedom to, have food or have healthcare or whatever. And they would.
Well, I don't actually know that very many of them would actually care very strongly about the even the rhetoric of liberty, because a great many socialists, especially in the current,
I'm talking. I guess
have abandoned that entirely.
I guess I'm talking more about the Jacobin crowd here then.
Sure. Well, even the Jacobin crowd,
they get involved in a lot of anti-libertarian counter signaling, But people who don't get caught up in that game too much, when they say this is the socialist conception of freedom. Mm-hmm. That's what they want to say. So what would you have to say to that?
Well, it's very similar to the primitivist case. There is, I'm a reasonable human being. These people are not fash. So I'm if somebody is blah, 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 you can talk about all these abstracts about the overall net freedom in the universe. And what do you want? You want us all to turn into a hot gas that's a hot plasma of highly internetworked, quantum states or whatever. That's completely unrealistic and beyond whatever. And your hive-mindy kind of conclusions would be so far, blah, blah. what about how does that cash out in the immediate sense? And I'm 100% sympathetic to that person, right? Like somebody who wants food on their table because their kids are starving to death that is a reasonable impulse, and all of these abstract questions are very disconnected from that need that they have. But in the same way that a libertarian would respond, a more conventional libertarian would respond and say something like, yeah, okay, but there are these secondary consequences. There are these things that fall out if you try to like use the state, or you just throw away, the NAP, if that's something you're trying to like build up, or whatever the thing is that you're turning is your central point. If you reject these abstract things, then you're gonna face some problems in the future. And so I broadly agree with many of the impulses that socialists have. I think this is actually very common among certain libertarians, certainly cosmopolitan libertarians. There's and this has been commented on many times, that cosmopolitan libertarians oftentimes feel closer affinity towards like socialists than they do towards other people, even though their prescriptions are wildly different. Because there is a sense in which like the socialist, unlike the fascist, does not necessarily want the bad thing. The socialist creates the bad thing in pursuit of the good thing, right? As a whoopsie-daisy accident that ends up killing millions of people, or creating more oppressive sales tax regimes. I don't know. Depends on the socialist, but I would say that in the same the mistake that the socialist makes is the same mistake that the liberal in the generic sense makes. They try to achieve a few more instrumental ends, like not ultimate ends, because they don't believe in ultimate ends. Especially the Bolshevik would be like, oh, and the Marxist-Leninist would be like, oh, this is just pure abstract theory. It's not material, like concrete anything.
Ideology or whatever.
Yeah, you're it's just idealism. You have this abstract ideal that you've created in terms of freedom, and you're like willing to sacrifice all these tangible things in pursuit of that. And we could have a longer conversation about why I think ethics skews ultimately towards that conception of freedom, why that becomes the ultimate goal, et cetera, and these other things. But in terms of like the direct, immediate, I have absolute sympathy for somebody who's like, look, I just want to vote for socialists because they said that they would cancel my student debt, which I'm suffocating under, and they would like feed my fucking kids. I have absolute sympathy for that person. I don't think that person is making that deep of a mistake. I think that person is making, they're not thinking it through enough. But the needs that they have are so immediate that I think we can, have some sense of sympathy for the mistakes that they're making in terms of their prescriptions. But they are making a mistake. If you vote Bernie Sanders or Corbyn into office, they may be better than some other, horrible monstrosity in some sense, but they will still fuck some things up. And one of the the classic, and so this classic thing is that you try to achieve some things and you end up costing further gains. So if all that you can conceive of when you're oppressed is just a fucking, like, I just don't want to have to work. I just don't want to have to work, 80 hours to keep my kids alive. I just want food and public health care and a house to live in. And that's literally the most I can conceive of, right? Like that's the most that I could ever imagine in the world. Then, I'm not going to be able to reach that person by being like, there are so many things you could have after you have those things. There are so many things in the future, well beyond that point, once those things are secured through however they get secured, and there's very different ways they can get secured. And if you go through path A and you create a socialist redistribution, police state or whatever, you will not be able to achieve those further goods. Or if you go through like the neoliberal kind of like the state creates these various things and provides a welfare net and forcibly creates markets out of like communal traditional systems and blah, blah, blah. And you get some of these benefits too, but you are prevented from getting any further benefits, right? Like, I mean, this is the classic problem that statists make, or at least that good faith folks will make when they embrace statism as a means. They sacrifice future gains for immediate gains. They're like, oh, well, you're talking about all these fancy sci-fi things. Like, who cares if, like, I don't care about trans people being able to get a DIY, quickly printed hormone replacement therapy. I just want to get food on the table. So I'll vote for Donald Trump because he said that he would get me food on the table for every white person or something like that, Like, the there are trade-offs that are being made there, and I'm a universalist, and I take like a really long lens, and I think that that's what radicalism is you take the longest possible lens, you try to see the widest possible context, and creating a state, especially a state with more power or that kind of thing, in order to solve these problems, is a self-compounding problem itself, and it deeply impedes further growth and further progress and accomplishment. So if, what I would say to these people is what I've said to them all is I give the general thing. I say, well, ideals are valuable in such and such way, and we need to be clear about what we actually value so that we're not in self-contradiction. And, like we sort through our values much the same way that we sort through strategies or commitments in other ways, like an ought becomes a different sort of ought over time, like and logical coherence and structure, variety of different philosophical things. But I also try to give like concrete examples that most leftists have some resonance with. So one that I bring up constantly is that, the AFL-CIO trade unionist, like kind of like the New Deal the new order brought by the New Deal.
The one that killed the Wildcat unions.
Yeah, it killed the Wildcat unions, and it stultified labor in this country and caused the collapse of labor power. It was a bad deal, but it was a bad deal that bought a lot of people, millions of people, immediate relief. And I can't condemn them too hard on that front. I can condemn them in some abstract sense, but I can't condemn them too hard for taking that sucker's deal, because they were really desperate. And, I was homeless growing up. Like, my family for a while was on the streets, and then we lived in the projects. And, like, my family we have been saved many times by food stamps. We would have starved to death without it, or been in really, really bad straits. I still have scars from malnutrition in various ways. And I'm not going to condemn anyone too hard for, when the prison warden offers a food program, accepting the food program, even if the food the prison warden is giving you is laced with fucking drugs that make it so that you can't like fight further against the prison system, against the warden that has, chained you down. Sometimes you just need to eat. But ultimately, when we can, we should, as much as possible, try to keep our eyes to the horizon, try to understand the distant struggles and how shortcuts and immediate opportunities can lead to catastrophic impediments in the future. So, maybe we get some sort of magical, fully automated communism. I think Leigh Phillips wrote a whole book about how the ideal of current communism is Walmart, and that we will just like all be a part of the great glorious People's Republic of Walmart in whatever sense, and it will distribute food and force us to work, and that this will be like the great and glorious future because some people won't be starving. But maybe through some metric or some evaluation that would be better. I mean, there's a lot of people starving around the world, and if something could magically somehow, and I don't think that socialism or state socialism could do this, but if it could somehow immediately alleviate that, maybe that would be a net positive in some local sense. But in the long term, the damage that would be done as a consequence of that would be quite severe. And I think that there are a lot of things that we should want beyond just food and housing. And I want those things for all, absolutely. But there are different ways you get that. There are different ways you
want
achieve
to separate out the means by which we attain these noble ends from all right.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good place to end in general. So the last question I'd like to ask on this is, what are 3 books, you can take this as broadly or narrowly as you want, or articles or documentaries or what have you, that you would recommend the audience read on this topic or adjacent ones?
Well, I mean, so we talked a lot about positive liberty and the broader libertarian movement. Cato did a good piece on that, positive and negative liberty.
Are you talking about the Unbound?
Yeah, Cato Unbound had a basically
who else was
variety of people exchanged essays on this topic. I think it was back in 2010.
Philip Petit, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't agree with any of those authors as you've heard, but it's background reading. In terms of more broad reading, as always, I want to stump Kevin Carson's, like, all the books that we put out and all the stuff that happens there. I think anarchism, if you're interested in that more generally, we can talk about like various works that speak to that. In terms of positive freedom, I've written a number of things, some a lot less philosophical, some more philosophical. Spreading Fire Through the Universe, Your Freedom is My Freedom, The Premise of Anarchism. And there are a variety of anarchist authors that I think cover a number of things related to this. David Graeber writes about, inside of, I believe, I'm trying to remember which book, I think Bureaucracy, in his book Bureaucracy. He talks about an aggregation of a bunch of studies that people have had about how humans like to be able to change the world. They like to see their options having consequences, and how they go catatonic, or they start tending in more authoritarian modes of thinking when they don't think that their actions have consequences upon the world. And there's a lot in there that speaks in deep resonance with the kind of positive liberty focus or lens that I'm talking about. So.
All right. Well, Will Gillis, thank you for coming on the show today.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I'd like to thank Will again for coming on the show and having such a lively, long, and philosophically intense conversation. As I mentioned earlier, if you like this show and want to support what we do, you can support us on Patreon. If you decide to do so, you can get special bonus content and swag as a thank you for your support, including bonus roundtable episodes, free books, buttons, and zines, and depending on how much you donate, special credit at the end of our show. If that sounds appealing to you, or if you just want to support us on having these types of conversations, you can find out more at patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ss.org. Here's a special thank you to our very generous associate producers, Stacey Jamal, Wendy Stoyleroff, Derek W., David Colburn, Ackneralls, Cecil Dion, Richard, DT, Sam, James Tuttle, and Danny O'Brien. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you will join us on the next episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. I just wanted to plug the Center real quick and all the great work they do on the website. If you are enjoying this conversation, you can read a lot of Will's writing at the Center's website, c4ss.org. He recently had a really strong critique of Glenn Will and Eric Posner's recent book, Radical Markets. You can also read a wide variety of other books, articles, and zines. Another article really relevant to some of the points Will made in our conversation is an article by Camilo Gomez on the danger of right-wing fusionism for American libertarians. If you're interested in these types of topics, I do recommend you check out c4ss.org or any of the books or swag on c4ss.org/store. This show and everything else the Center does would not be possible without our donors and Patreons. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/c4ss.org.